The year is 1541. In the royal apartments of Hampton Court Palace, a young woman is screaming. Her voice tears through the corridors, raw and desperate, begging for mercy from a king who will never hear her. Her name is Catherine Howard. She is 19 years old, possibly younger. 6 months ago, she was Queen of England, the fifth wife of Henry VIII, one of the most powerful men in the world. Now she is a prisoner, accused of treason, adultery, and crimes against the crown. And in the weeks between her arrest and her execution, what they do to her will be so cruel, so methodically designed to break her spirit, that by the time the axe finally falls, death will feel like release. Because what happened to Catherine Howard wasn't just punishment, it was annihilation. A calculated campaign to destroy not just her body, but her reputation, her dignity, and any shred of humanity she had left. And here's the part that makes it unbearable. She was a child. Not in the legal sense, perhaps, but in every way that mattered. A girl raised in neglect, exploited by men who saw her youth and beauty as tools to be used, discarded when inconvenient. So why does her story matter nearly 500 years later? Because what they did to Catherine reveals something fundamental about how power treats women, how it consumes them, how it punishes them not just for their crimes, but for daring to exist in a world where their only value is their usefulness to men. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be destroyed piece by piece, publicly, deliberately, while the world watches and does nothing, you're about to find out. Here on this channel we examine the historical records that others ignore. Court documents from the Tudor archives, eyewitness testimonies discovered in private collections, letters that were never meant to survive. Every view, every subscription helps us pull one more forgotten voice out of the darkness. Now, let's go back to Hampton Court, because Catherine Howard is screaming and no one is coming to save her. To understand what happened to Catherine, you need to understand who she was before the crown devoured her. She wasn't born into power. She was born into chaos. Catherine's father, Lord Edmund Howard, was a younger son of the Duke of Norfolk, which meant he had a title but no money. He couldn't afford to raise his daughter properly, so Catherine was sent to live with her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in a sprawling household filled with servants, distant relatives, and too little supervision. By age 13, Catherine had already been sexually exploited by her music tutor, Henry VIII, who later testified that he had touched her in ways that were not appropriate. By 15, she was involved with Francis Derham, a young man in the Duchess's household, who claimed they were pre-contracted to marry, which in Tudor England was legally binding. But there was no marriage. There was only exploitation. Catherine was young, naive, desperate for affection, and surrounded by people who saw her not as a person, but as an opportunity. In 1540, when Catherine was around 18 years old, she caught the attention of King Henry VIII. Henry was 49, obese, suffering from festering ulcers on his leg that filled the rooms with the stench of rotting flesh. His fourth marriage to Anne of Cleves had been annulled within months, because Henry claimed he couldn't consummate the marriage, though the real reason was that he found her unattractive. Henry wanted youth, beauty, vitality, and Catherine Howard, with her dark hair, her bright eyes, and her desperate eagerness to please, seemed like the perfect solution. They married on July 28, 1540. Henry called her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with jewels, gowns, estates. He paraded her through court, showing off his young, beautiful queen to foreign ambassadors and courtiers, who smiled and bowed while privately mocking the aging king and his child bride. Catherine had no idea what she had walked into. She thought marriage to the king would bring security, safety, status. She didn't realize she had married a man who had already executed 2 wives, and who saw women not as people, but as reflections of his own ego. For a year, Catherine played the role of queen. She attended banquets, wore the jewels, smiled at the right moments. But behind the facade she was terrified. Terrified of Henry's temper. Terrified of his expectations. Terrified that one wrong move would destroy her. And in the autumn of 1541, that fear became reality. In October 1541, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer received information from John Lascelles, a Protestant reformer, about Catherine's past. Lascelles claimed that before her marriage to Henry, Catherine had been involved with Francis Derham and Henry Manox. Cranmer investigated. He questioned servants from the Dowager Duchess's household. He gathered testimonies. And on November 2nd, All Souls' Day, while Henry attended Mass at Hampton Court Chapel, Cranmer handed him a letter detailing the accusations. Henry didn't believe it at first. He couldn't. His rose without a thorn, the girl who made him feel young again, couldn't have betrayed him. He ordered an investigation, convinced it would prove Catherine's innocence. But the investigation didn't prove innocence. It uncovered more. Under interrogation, Francis Derham confessed to his relationship with Catherine. Henry Manox confirmed the inappropriate encounters. And then came the most damaging revelation of all. Thomas Culpeper. Culpeper was a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, young, handsome, ambitious, and according to testimony from Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, Catherine had been meeting with him secretly during the royal progress through the north of England in the summer of 1541. Letters were produced. Letters in Catherine's own handwriting, addressed to Culpeper, filled with affection and longing. "I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see you and speak with you," she had written. Treason. Under Tudor law, adultery by the Queen was considered treason because it threatened the legitimacy of any children she might bear. The penalty for treason was death. On November 12, 1541, 10 days after the letter was delivered to Henry, Catherine was arrested. That's when the screaming began. According to eyewitness accounts from courtiers who were present at Hampton Court, Catherine tried to run to Henry. She broke free from the guards and sprinted down the gallery toward the chapel where the king was praying. She screamed his name. She begged him to listen. She pounded on the doors of the chapel, sobbing, pleading for mercy. Henry never opened the door. He ordered the guards to drag her away. The gallery where this happened is still called the Haunted Gallery today, because legend says you can still hear Catherine's screams echoing through the halls. Whether that's true or not, one thing is certain. That moment, when Catherine realized Henry would not see her, would not hear her, would not save her, was the moment she understood she was already dead. They took her to her chambers and placed her under house arrest. No visitors, no letters, just guards outside her door and silence pressing in from all sides. And here's where the psychological torture truly began. Because they didn't execute her immediately. They made her wait. They gave her time to think. Time to imagine what was coming. Time to break. On November 22nd, Catherine was interrogated by members of the Privy Council. They demanded she confess to adultery with Thomas Culpeper. She denied it. She admitted to the relationship with Francis Derham before her marriage, but insisted it had ended before she became queen. She swore she had never been unfaithful to Henry. It didn't matter. Under Tudor law, even if she hadn't committed adultery after marriage, her failure to disclose her previous relationships was considered treason by deception. She had come to the king's bed not as a virgin, not as the innocent girl he believed her to be, and that alone was enough to condemn her. They stripped her of her title. No longer queen, just Catherine Howard. They confiscated her jewels, her gowns, her estates. Everything that had made her feel safe, everything that had given her status, was ripped away in an instant. On December 1st, Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were tried for treason. Both were found guilty. Derham, because of his prior relationship with Catherine, was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal execution England had to offer. Culpeper, because he was a gentleman and had the king's favor, was granted a quicker death by beheading. On December 10th, they were executed at Tyburn. Catherine was told, not as a kindness, as a warning. This is what happens to those who betray the king. This is what's coming for you." She didn't eat for days after that. According to reports from her attendants, she barely spoke. She spent hours staring at the walls, trembling, whispering prayers that no one answered. They moved her to Sion Abbey in mid-December. Not a palace, not a prison. A former monastery, cold and isolated, where she was held under guard while Parliament debated her fate. For 2 months, she waited. And during those 2 months, something inside her broke. The girl who had screamed in the haunted gallery, who had begged Henry to listen, who had clung to hope, disappeared. In her place was someone hollow, someone who had stopped fighting, because there was nothing left to fight for. On February 11, 1542, Parliament passed the Bill of Attainder, a legal mechanism that allowed Catherine to be executed without a formal trial. The next day she was told she would be taken to the Tower of London. On February 10th, Catherine Howard was brought by barge to the Tower, the same tower where Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, had been executed less than 6 years earlier. Catherine knew what that meant. The Tower wasn't a prison you left alive. She was placed in the same apartments where Anne Boleyn had spent her final days. Whether this was intentional cruelty or mere practicality, the effect was the same. Catherine was surrounded by ghosts. On the evening of February 12th, the night before her execution, Catherine made a request that stunned her attendants. She asked to be brought the chopping block so she could practice laying her head upon it. They brought it to her chamber, and Catherine, 19 years old, terrified, alone, knelt on the cold stone floor and placed her neck on the block. Again and again, rehearsing her own death. Why would she do that? Because she was terrified of dying badly, terrified of flinching, terrified of screaming, terrified that in her final moments she would lose the only thing she had left, her dignity. Think about that. A teenage girl, alone in a cell, practicing how to die with grace because she knows the whole world will be watching. That image, more than anything, reveals the depth of her terror. On the morning of February 13, 1542, they came for her. Catherine was dressed in a black gown. Her hair was pinned up, exposing her neck. She was led across the Tower Green to the scaffold. A small crowd had gathered. Nobles, officials, witnesses required by law. Catherine climbed the steps. She stood before the block, and then she spoke. Her voice was steady, but soft, almost a whisper. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper. God have mercy on my soul. Good people, I beg you pray for me." Then she knelt. The executioner, the same man who had beheaded Lady Salisbury less than a year before, asked for her forgiveness. She gave it. She placed her neck on the block, and the axe fell. Catherine Howard was 19, possibly 20 years old. She had been Queen of England for 16 months, and in the weeks before her death, they had stripped away everything that made her human. Her title, her dignity, her hope, everything except the memory of a boy she had loved and a life she would never have. But here's the cruelty that history often overlooks. Catherine's execution wasn't about justice. It was about control. Henry VIII didn't execute her because she had betrayed him. He executed her because she had made him look like a fool, an aging, impotent king who couldn't satisfy his teenage bride, a man whose ego was so fragile that the only way to restore it was to destroy the girl who had dared to remind him of his failures. Catherine Howard was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the same chapel where Anne Boleyn lay. For centuries, no one knew exactly where she was. It wasn't until 1876, during renovation work, that her remains were identified. By then, she had been reduced to a cautionary tale. The queen who danced too much. The girl who made poor choices. History sanitized her story, turned her into a villain or a fool. Anything but what she really was. A victim. So why does this story matter nearly 5 centuries later? Because Catherine Howard's tragedy reveals something we still see today. How society punishes women for being young, for being exploited, for daring to exist in a world designed to consume them. Catherine never had a chance. She was used by men who saw her as a tool, married to a king who saw her as a trophy, executed by a system that saw her as disposable. And yet, in her final moments, she found a kind of defiance. "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." That line, whispered on a scaffold, echoes through history, because it was Catherine's way of saying, "You can kill me, you can erase me, but you cannot take away the one thing I chose for myself. My heart belonged to him, and that you will never control. You've just witnessed one of Tudor England's darkest cruelties." If stories like this remind you how power devours the vulnerable, how easily innocence is punished, then subscribe and help keep these voices alive. Because some truths deserve to be remembered, especially the ones history tried to bury. Catherine Howard was meant to disappear. A scandal, a mistake, a girl whose name would be whispered as a warning, but she didn't disappear. She's still here, in the records of her trial, in the testimony of those who watched her die, in the quiet courage of a 19-year-old girl who practiced laying her head on a block because she refused to die badly. And now she's here with you, because you listened, because you remembered, because you refused to let her silence be the final word.